Kevin, are you ready to start the ball rolling and let everybody get introduced and stuff? Or?
Sure, let's do that. Let's do that.
Okay.
Let me put this on, make sure I've got this on speaker view. Good. Awesome. Okay, well, we've reached out to Frank, and I know Ron's, I don't think Ron's feeling up to being on today, but we reached out to Frank and it's bouncing back to us and not showing delivered. So I think Frank's phone is off. I hope everything's well with him. But we do have Rick Dreistadt and Bob Schultz with us. And oh, there we go. George says Ron sends his regrets and offers a special greeting to Bob Schultz and Rick Dreistadt. There we go. You know what I'm thinking here is, let's start with you, Rick, and then we'll go back to you, Bob, because we just heard from you a bit. You know what I think makes sense is tell us a little bit about your background in railroading and with the Monon both, okay? And then you know what you did for the Monon, and then we can go into some of your favorite stories about the Monon. I think that's what most of us are wanting to hear is some of your favorite memories of the Monon. So Rick, why don't you start with that, and then we'll just kind of, then we'll have Bob do the same thing, and we'll go back and forth.
Okay. Well, as far as since this was about the Barriger era, I came along past that. I was born in '46, and I lived at Clay City, Indiana, which is on the I&L branch of the Monon. It was a little coal branch. Originally, it was supposed to go from Indianapolis to Evansville, and I've even seen where it was thought about going to Vincennes. But it ended up going from Wallace Junction near Cloverdale, Indiana, to the Greene County coal fields. And I grew up in Clay City, seeing the coal trains going through there. During my time, there was two mines still working. At one time, there had been as many as 50 on that branch. So anyway, I started running down to the agent's office. He started teaching me agency work and telegraphy. So eventually, when I got to be 16 years old, my mom took me to Lafayette, Indiana, and I was going to start signing up to be an extra agent and operator during summers between high school. And I hadn't much more than gotten home. Railroad called and wanted to know if I could go to Bloomington, Indiana and work at McDowell Yards on weekends, which I started doing. I wasn't even 16 yet. I was still just a little bit shy of that. And that worked that way every weekend till I was out of school for the summer. And railroad started sending me to these agencies. Somebody told me they'll probably keep you close to home. You're so young. Well, they didn't know the railroad. First place they sent me was Francisville, Indiana, which was 30 miles north of Lafayette, about 2.5 hours from my house. And I went from Francisville to San Pierre, which was a few more miles north, and then to Wanata, and then to Haskell's. And by that time, I was almost into the Lake Michigan. And that was my first summer. So, in fact, I worked over the next 2 summers, high school vacation, and Christmas and Thanksgiving holidays. They'd find someplace for me to work. And most of the time I worked northern Indiana. The only time I ever worked south was a little town of Pekin, Indiana, which was about 25 miles north of Louisville. They sent me down here for 2 days to work the agency. Here I was, I guess, 17 years old. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Never dreamed at the time that one day I'd live down here, and to this day my daughter, who I didn't even dream I'd have a daughter at that time, but my daughter lives in Pekin. So after I graduated from high school in 1964, I worked the extra board for a while, and there was railroad asked me if I'd be willing to come to Lafayette and train as dispatcher. So I worked up at Lafayette, Indiana in the AD office, which was a telegraph office next to the dispatcher, and trained with the dispatchers and became qualified as a dispatcher in 1966. So I worked as a dispatcher until 1971 after the merger. Well, actually 76, then I was still dispatching for the L&N. They asked me to come to Louisville and work in the operations center in management. So I worked that from 76 until 80. Decided management wasn't for me for a couple of reasons, so I went back to being a dispatcher. And in the, I guess it was the mid 80s, the L&N was going to move their dispatchers to Jacksonville. I didn't want to go to Jacksonville, and I had 2 teenage kids that about ready to graduate high school. They didn't want to go. My wife didn't want to go. So I went back to being an operator, which lasted a very short time in Louisville. And the L&N asked me then to work at the yardmaster at Osborne Yards, which I did until I retired in 2006. So I had 44 years then, and the day I was eligible, I thought that was enough, so I retired in 2006.
Nice.
One of the things about the Monon, I think Mr. Barriger stressed this, and I understand that before he came around, the Monon was hard pressed for well, they didn't have the business. They didn't have the money to really run the trains on a schedule, so they just waited until they got a full train of business and they would run a train. And anyone that's ever run a business knows you can't run a business if you don't know when you're going to get your business, your cars. So he instituted a program that the freight trains would run on time. And that was what I came into when I was a dispatcher. Our hotshot train was number 71. He left Southampton about 8 p.m. of an evening. And at 8 o'clock the next morning, he was rolling into Louisville. In between, he would stop at Monon, Indiana. He would make a set out, pick up some hot RCA cabinets, which a local would bring in there. And they would come to Lafayette. Lafayette would reduce their Lafayette cars, add Louisville business and Bloomington business. They would add a locomotive or change locomotives because Kevin had mentioned that the railroad changes abruptly south of Lafayette to Louisville. It's hillier, requires more power. So, and they change crews. Within 1 hour, he would be leaving Lafayette. They would stop at Linden, which was nickel plate interchange point, 20 miles south of Lafayette. Pick up hot Ford auto parts for Louisville. And the next stop would be Bloomington Yards, McDowell, where the McDowell would reduce their Bloomington cars on him, add a Louisville fill out. And his next stop would be at New Albany. He would set hot Pillsbury products out at New Albany and then go across the river into the K&I yards. That power on that train and the crews would turn around, grab a northbound train, and head back to Bloomington. And their hotshot northbound train was number 70 that operated about the same way that 71 did. He would leave Louisville about 6 to 7 o'clock of an evening, and hopefully by 6 or 7 a.m. The next morning he would be rolling into Southampton. So that was a change that Mr. Barriger had made during his administration, and it was still in effect when up until the day the L&N took over. And one thing that Mr. Barriger, of course, it was brought up earlier that he had these cards that he was a traveling freight agent and president. And whether we know it or not, anyone that worked on Monon was in a sense a traveling freight agent. I found out Well, an agent especially, that should have been part of his job, was to go out and try to get business off the customers. Most of them just took it with a grain of salt. Some agents would, some, well, I hate to say it, they discouraged it because they didn't want to have to work too hard. If you're going to get that with any business you go into. But the way the carmen handled the freight cars, if they needed repairs, the engineers, train crews that handled the trains, that reflected how the customer was going to get his business. So that's my background, at least.
Nice. And you said, Rick, most of it was the Northern Division, and you mentioned several locations on the Michigan City branch. Was most of it on Michigan City branch, or did you serve other locations on the Northern Division?
Well, I worked at, in addition to the Michigan City branch, including Michigan City that I didn't mention, I'd also worked South Hammond, Dyer, St. John, and Lowell. I never worked at Monon. The Indianapolis branch, all I ever worked was a week or two at Delphi and at Belt Junction. And I worked on the Middle Division. I worked, of course, AD at Lafayette and shops in the yards. Greencastle and McDowell Yards and Pekin. I believe that's all of them. That's enough to.
Nice. Well, we'll come back for another story about that, because I really like your description of 71 and 70 and how they operate, and we'll come back to that or other stuff. Bob, tell us about your background in railroading and on the Monon.
Well, I don't want to plagiarize your heading there about growing up, but I lived with the Monon. My dad started on the Monon in 1918, and by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, we were taking Sunday picnics on the Monon from Hammond to Monticello or Frankfurt, and spend a couple of hours walking around the towns or having ice cream, and then catching the late passenger train out of Indianapolis back to Hammond for a Sunday afternoon. And so the Monon was in my blood real early. And then during the war, my dad was the assistant foreman at the South Hammond Rip Track, and they had to have some official on duty 7 days a week because of the troop train movements and things going through, and then all the various reports that had to be done. And so he would come home for an hour, go to church, and after church I would go back to South Hammond with him, and this is I'm 11 years old, go to South Hammond and sit there, and pretty soon they would bring an engine down over the cinder pit, and the hostler would get out and he'd say, "Young Schultz, you want to ride back to the roundhouse?" And so I would get the ride back to the roundhouse. Well, anyhow, the word got out that Otto Schultz had a couple of boys, and I graduated out of high school in 1947, and I was only 17, and I was working part-time for a guy doing carpet cleaning and rug cleaning, and when I turned 18 in January, I would borrow my dad's car and go around and try to look for work, and I didn't find anything. And then the 11th of February, I had the car, and I came back to pick my dad up, and I saw he was in the office with the car foreman, and just walked in, and the car foreman looked up at me, and he said, "Why aren't you working?" And I said, "Well, I just been out look." I never finished the sentence, and he said, "Otto, why didn't you tell me your boy's looking for work? Can you tell blue, green, yellow, and blue, red, green, and yellow?" And I said, "Yeah." he said, you go to the doctor in the morning and you pick out those 4 strings and you come back here and I'll hire you. And so I went to the doctor the next morning and I came back on the 12th of February of 1948. I hired out on the Monon as a helper. And the first job was getting the oil can and the waste packing and going around and oiling all the oil boxes on the rip track and where they had to pull out a brass or general brass. Why, you'd take a bucket and a hook and pull all the packing out of the box, and they would come and look at the wedge or at the journal brass. And when it was all done, all right, here, now this is how you repack the box. And so I got all the instructions how to change the dope and the packing. And then when the car came through to be repacked with all 8 boxes, all right, you got all 8 boxes to change. And when you get through with that, you go down to the pile of brake shoes and you look to see which brake shoes are worn out, and you lay the brake shoes down where the carman can change the brake shoes. Well, this went on for 3 or 4 weeks, you know, and then little by little, okay, here you got this crew wants a little bit of help changing the coupler out. You bring the coupler, get that fork truck and bring not a fork truck, but like one of those 2-wheel cart deals that. Okay, bring the coupler over there to him. Well, all right. And then the next day, well, here, bring some springs over. We got to change some springs in this car. I was there about 2 months, and the foreman came over and he said, Otto, where's your boy? He's over there. What can he change those springs by himself? And my dad came over and he said, you want to change those springs? I said, yeah, I've seen. So I got the jack and the hook to lift the bolster, and I changed the 2 broken springs in an L&N hopper car that was there. And the foreman said, okay, you're a promoted helper now. You get 7 cents an hour more. You get 83 cents an hour. All right, so I'm a promoter helper. What does that? Now you can work with all the rest of the men and help them. You don't have to do just this. So then the next day was help change the wheel, roll the wheels around, and the next day, those little gondolas. That's where I cut my eye teeth on, because McDowell was repainting a bunch of hopper cars, and Lafayette was repainting a bunch of cars. And as these wooden hoppers, as the wooden gondolas came back, they were replacing all the broken planks. And if the posts were all spread out, you had to have a man with a torch to heat the post and put a jack on an angle and push all the posts back in place, and then put the boards in and pull them up. And all right, so you got 10 boards. 9 boards, I guess, to a side of the car. If you put in 6 of them, you got to paint, you know, you paint them and put the stencils back on. So one of those gondolas that I got there is the first car that they gave me a brush, and as long as you paint the whole car, and we'll re-stencil it and send it back. Okay. All right. Then the next thing that's coming through is the 9000 series boxcars had truss plates on them. They were being paid off because they were buying the new equipment. So here you're going to take a chisel and you cut the 2 rivets off of the holding the truss plate on, and the car's paid for. One thing I got to say, the 9000 series boxcars and the first steel hoppers, where the cars came through with CIL and the Chicago, Indianapolis, Louisville Reliable Herald from 1940. And they were marked CIL. But you know, the steam locomotives and the passenger cars never got CIL. They were all still listed CI and L on the locomotives, and on the ends of the passenger cars, it still said CI and L. in May, 3 steam engines showed up on the rip track that were going for scrap. The 231, the 514, and the 564. And since I'd been taking truss plates off, I looked around and the truss plates were still on the tender of the 564. And I told my dad, and he went to the car foreman called Lafayette right away. Oh, take that off, take that off. We can't sell, the locomotive is paid for. We can't sell a locomotive if it's not paid for. Well, anyhow, I end up with my sample 514.
Oh, that's
out
awesome.
of those
That's
out of
great.
those three locomotives. And that 514 was the subject of a Hoosier Line story that Marquardt and the Dozals put together to show that the 514 was not the locomotive in Tennessee, but the 525 was down there. So I got a little bit of history to save to show what was going on. Drysdale pointed out about the 71 and 70. Now I started in 48. By the summer of 48, the one fellow that was the inspector on the rip track started filling vacations. And so I was sort of bouncing around between other fellows that I was working with. And he was filling vacations. And then when the trains came in from Chicago, from the clearing and the IHB, the longer trains sometimes stretched across 173rd Street. And they had me go out with the oil can to relieve some of the inspectors' time oiling the boxes. And I did this for a little bit, and then an inspector got sick. And they said, okay, you're going to go out there. The guy that was filling the vacations took the inspector's job. And they said, you're going to go out there for 3 days with the car inspectors and learn what to look for. So I'm out in the yard as a young kid out there in the yard. And the first thing they taught me, when you open the box lid, you put the back of your hand against the journal, because if there's any heat coming out of the journal, the back of your hand is going to feel it first. A lot of times you didn't. A lot of times you lifted the lid and you could smell it, that the waste was bad. And so, but anyhow, I was out there for 3 days, and then they said, okay, you're going to fill the rest of the vacations. Your first job is at nighttime. So I'm working on a night job. I wasn't out there a week, and learning how the 71 had to leave here at 9:45, and 75 left an hour later, and 91 was after or before 75 and after. There were 3 trains left that night: 71 and 75 and 91. Well, about let's say 2 weeks into this job, the night train from the clearing didn't show up on time. And all they had was an afternoon IHB train that came in with empty L&N hoppers. It got to be 8:30. It got to be 8:45. At about 8:45, the clearing train showed up, and they started to inspect it, but they don't have any time. The engine is for 71. We're called for 9:45 departure. They put these 15 empty L&N hoppers over here, put the caboose on. They said, we'll take care of the inspection. You get the train out. They backed the 3-unit train to 15 empty L&N hoppers. I walked the air brakes on them, gave them a highball. 9:45, 71 left South Hammond. Frank Cheshire was the man running the railroad, and Frank Cheshire called somebody, because the next night all these other trains were in on time. And 71 was still on time with all the meat and everything else that came
All the
through.
transfers. Yeah.
All the high quality stuff, you know.
Right.
So this was typical of the Monon under Barriger and Cheshire. Everybody knew what they were to do, and then the business grew, that instead of 25 or 30 cars on 71, we were getting 65, sometimes the full train, sometimes the 69 car train.
Yep.
But it went at 9:45. Then I was after the vacations were over, I was back on the rip track again for about a little over 6 months, 7 months. And the guy from the Chicago Freight House retired, and I was the youngest inspector, so they sent me. I got the job as a car inspector at the Chicago Freight House, and I spent 1.5 years in Chicago. At the Freight House is right next to the Dearborn Street Station, so I'm riding into Chicago I'm riding in on number 12 every day, and then the freight train, the local Southampton Yard crew would come in the afternoon to switch the house, and you'd have 15, 16 freight cars that would come out with merchandise, and you would ride the caboose back to Hammond, and that was my day. In between here, sometime in 49, they went from 6-day a week to 5-day a week, and they brought 4 or 5 apprentice guys up from Lafayette to help fill the voids when they made 5-day a week jobs versus 7-day a week jobs. And so there were a lot of jobs that were off Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and one guy had a job that he worked 1 day on the rip track and 4 days in the yard inspecting in order to get his 5 days in.
5 days. Yeah.
I worked the Chicago Freight House until April of 51, and I came back on the rip track. And in August of 51, I was drafted, so I went in the Army, and I was fortunate enough to get into to Fort Eustis to the Transportation Corps.
Yeah.
And I learned again what I learned for 3.5 years. Before there's still a war in Korea, and the engineers were rebuilding an air base, or rebuilding 3 air bases up in Canada, and they picked a bunch of us out and they sent us up to Newfoundland and to Labrador and to Thule, Greenland, where the Army was working. And so I spent the summer up there. I came back and went back to the Army Railroad side, and I was fortunate enough to draw special duty on an Army hospital car that was brand new. They had a new version. One second. I'm still building. I'm just finishing what I started 67 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
Is the newer version of the hospital car, and I'm just finishing it up. Well, anyhow, I came back to the Monon and went back to the rip track, and Barriger is gone. Then Warren Brown is in, but it's still a good. The biggest difference was they took 91 off and put all the Indianapolis cars on 75. 71 was still through Louisville train. 75 had the Indianapolis cars on the head end and dropped them off and gone. The reverse was with 70 coming north. 70 picked the Indianapolis cars up brought them to Hammond.
Right.
And so you had 3 trains a day instead of 4, and the local was every other day.
Right.
But now you were talking about the Ryder car. The freight house in Chicago would put out a boxcar that had Dyer to Monon freight in it, and the conductor and the head man would ride the Ryder car, and they would have that Ryder car, the boxcar with the LCL freight right behind the Ryder car. The guy in the caboose was only the flagman. He was back, because when they got to these towns to do the switching, the conductor would get off at the depot, and the head man with him, and line the switches, and the flagman is in the back end to protect the train.
Wow.
The conductor and the brakeman would ride right behind the engine, so they were there to do all the work. Then they built a freight house in South Hammond, and they built a piggyback ramp, and the piggyback ramp came in, and they started piggyback service in '54 when they built the freight house.
Yep.
Well, I got something here someplace. I'm trying to find it.
These are great props.
Anyhow, in 1957, they had the 500th piggyback car, and I loaded it, and they had a big sign on the sign, Reynolds Metal 500 Monon piggyback car, and I built a model of it. I thought I had it up here, but I don't. Well, anyhow, so then the piggyback car, and then they started to get a bunch of machinery movement to Indianapolis, and they would bring the machinery on trailers, but it wasn't blocked per AAR loading rules. And so they would set the load the trailers on the flat cars, and then set the flat cars over by the rip track so that you could do all the blocking, and then take them back. And then once they were, another fellow and I were working 3 or 4 hours overtime a couple of nights a week when these trailers full of machinery came. Then we would go and cut the blocking and block all the loads on the trailers so that they could go down. Well, all right. In 1959, I got into a little falling out with the car foreman. That was the guy that was the roundhouse foreman was also the car foreman by then, and he was wanting to cut down a little bit instead of putting rivets in like we were patching cars. Put some bolts in there. And I said, Pat, that's never going to hold with the bolts. Oh, I told you to do that. So I talked to the train master, Tony Kazubel, and I said, are you looking for any switchmen? Oh, Bob, he said, I got a job for you tomorrow. So I went switching for 3 months, and I was in the shanty by the roundhouse to get an engine one day, and this foreman said, you got to call Lafayette. Kaufman wants to talk to you. And I said, oh, I don't know. So I used a telephone. So I called. We know you did welding. Mr. Kaufman said, we know you were doing welding at Hammond. We're rebuilding some hopper cars. Would you come down to Lafayette and work in the shop for a year, and we'll put you out as a foreman someplace after a year in the shop. So I talked to my wife, and I went down to Lafayette and went to work. And they were cutting the old cars apart and putting new sides in and everything. And I worked in Lafayette from like July, August of '59 till April of '60. And in April of '60 was a steel strike, and all the mills went down, and the material for rebuilding the hopper cars dried up in a hurry. And so they had to bring a couple of box cars in to put some flooring in. And they started laying off a bunch of the guys they had guys that came from Frankfort, Indiana, from the nickel plate, and from Ironton, Indiana, Ironton, Ohio, and the NNW for rebuilding where the nickel plate and the NNW were rebuilding hopper cars. Anyhow, they start laying these guys off. And I thought, that's not for me. And a guy from Pullman Standard contacted me and he said, Bob, we're looking for a welder at Pullman. We're going to rebuild piggyback cars and we need somebody with railroad experience. And I didn't go to the first try. And he saw me about 2 weeks later and he said, that job is still open. And so I went over and I'm filling out the application and a man came in and he said, Bruce, I need a welder. And Bruce said, I'm hiring one now for the Hammond plant. And the man walked over to me and he said, I don't know what he offered you, but I'll give you $10 a week more if you can pass my welding test. So I went in right away and I passed the welding test and I went to work for Pullman Research and Development as a welder. And it was one of 4 welders in the research shop. And I got in with cars that were 5, 6, 7 years ahead of time. Everything was new and never out on the road yet that we were working on.
So Bob, was that Pullman and Hammond?
In Pullman and Hammond, yeah, it was on Field Street. On Field Street. And I wasn't there a month, and they bring this car in. It's got 28-inch wheels instead of 33-inch wheels. It's got a real low profile. It's got a coupler raised up on the deck. And the coupler draft gear arrangement is 8 inches higher than to make the coupler at 34.5 inches. And looking at the car, and at the bottom of the center sill, it had big letters, Jack here. And I said to the boss, what are they going to jack that with? Oh, he said, they got floor jacks. I said, they don't have any floor jacks to raise that. Every rip truck in the country got 27-inch high air jacks. They got a jack under the body bolster. No. The next day, they sent a bunch of people out to all the different rip tracks to see how high how the jacks were. They all came back to 27 inches high. Within 3-4 days, they gave me a set of blueprints to build a new body bolster so that they had a jack pad to come out. And so my first job with Pullman Research is to build a body bolster for a low-level brand new car that never been out on the road. And I was able to work with the engineers and the welding technicians. I got my engineering associate degree through Pullman Standards engineering deal with all. They send you blueprints, weld this. You can't weld, you go through the prints. You can't weld this here, you got to change it. Well, anyhow, I left Pullman. I was working at Pullman, and one day I went down the road and I see this black and gold Fairbanks Morse switch engine in a siding. And I thought, that's 18. I pulled in and I talked to the guy and I said, what, I'm interested. He said, what do you know about that locomotive? I said, I used to work on the Monon. What do you do now? I'm a welder. I need a welder. I'm rebuilding trucks for Youngstown Steel. I need a welder. I'll give you a job welding and you can work on that locomotive. All right, so I took the job working for him, welding up equalizer bars for locomotive trucks, building up worn out holes, putting in new bushings. That 18, they brought up, you're talking about W.R. Grace, they brought a locomotive in from W.R. Grace that was numbered 102. It was an old Baldwin. John Seminar bought that, or had that Baldwin, took it off the trucks, the wheels and everything under the 18 were better than what, so we jacked the 18 up and took the good wheels out and put his old Baldwin trucks back under the 18, and I painted the whole inside and the outside and put Grace 102, and it went back to W.R. Grace in Florida someplace. All right. Then he leased the Monon Roundhouse in South Hammond, and we had 4 stalls in the Monon Roundhouse, and went out there, and I was like his foreman, supervising the rebuilding of some crane and these trucks. We were working the trucks over, and you could take the welding machine and hook it up to the truck leads to make the motors turn, that everything was in good shape, and making sure that crater grease was in the pans, and so I got locomotive work, and then there was something came up. I went to the Erie, and the Erie was looking for. They're looking for a car foreman, a train yard foreman, and I went over and they hired me, and I didn't spend my 30 days as a union guy. The foreman got sick, and they made me the train yard foreman, and then another foreman didn't want the job on the rip track with the wrecker, so I got the car foreman's wreck master job on the Erie. And my biggest time was when the Monon 71 wrecked in Rensselaer one night, and dumped about 15 or 18 cars right at the depot in Rensselaer. And they called the Erie called me and said, "Get your wrecker ready. You're going over to the Monon." And so I had the Erie wrecker and the wreck crew. We went down to Rensselaer, and I picked up a tank car, and then Mr. Jacoba was the mechanical officer, and there was a car of sulfuric acid that had ruptured, and the sulfuric acid was all over the roadbed in the area by the depot. And we picked up a boxcar and set it over, and the next car was a carload of flour. And he came over to me and he said, "Bob, can you dump that carload of flour into this acid?" And he said, "I'll send the guys up on the top to open up the hatches." I said, "Yeah, I can dump it. I can dump it." So we pulled the wrecker up, and I dumped the carload of flour into this acid. It just bubbled all over. And then he said, "You're done. We got to get some panel track." I said, "I got panel track back here." "No," he said, "we don't want to use yours. We'll get ours." Because I always carried a carload of panel track with the wrecker. "No, we'll use ours." He said, "You're done." So they took us back, and on the Erie we had a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit on the wrecker, with the wrecker. And I told the engineer we got 30 mile hours. I think we were doing closer to 40 coming back, because they wanted to get us back before midnight, so that it was all on a one-day deal.
Right.
Well, anyhow, then I left the Erie and started my own business, and that's when I started buying and selling things from the Monon. Even when I worked by the Roundhouse, working with John Seminar, I bought one of those gondolas and sold it to Jeff Bowden in New Albany, and I bought 4 old wooden boxcars, and I sold them to one of the scrap yards. And I said, "I want to get the air brakes off of there, because the triple valves were worth a lot of money." And they said, "Sure, we'll cut them off." So they cut the triple valves off. They burnt the boxcars. And then there was I bought you've probably seen pictures of the combine coach that was in the French lick train that used to go. It had 2 baggage doors and seating for about eight or nine windows. And after it was set off, after French Lick closed, it was set off by the Monon Depot for the Monon Depot in Monon. While they were rebuilding the depot, that combined baggage car was there.
Yep.
After the depot was built, that combine was put back on its trucks, and it was given 80153 number as a work car. While I was working with Sennheiser, I was getting some of these sale offerings from the Monon, and here was 80153. I bid $300 on that car, and I got it. And I knew where this junkyard, and I called him and I said, I got this old baggage car. What's it worth? He said, I'll give you $500. I said, sold. Now, $80153 as 317.
Nice. So, Bob, we're going to give you a bit of a break here, and you know the company you worked for at the Roundhouse was Industrial Maintenance Service, right?
Right, Industrial Maintenance Service.
Yep, because I remember when they got the 11 and the 14, and they rebuilt them for the J.
Yes, yes. He bought 6 old Fairbanks Morse from New York Central first that they cut up over there. And I'll tell you a story about that just real quick. While he was there, or while I was working there, Steve and I knew that the 45 and 46 were coming up for sale as usable units. And he made a contact with somebody from Mexico, and these Mexicans came up, and Steve and I told me, you know the Monon, these guys are going to fly out of Meigs Field. You go to Meigs Field and get on the airplane, and they're going to have a private plane. I went to Meigs Field, flew to the airport that's south of the Purdue Airport down there around west of Lafayette, someplace.
Right.
Had a rental car, drove over to the shop in Lafayette, and I'm sure. I knew Jacoba. I got to Jacoba. Jacoba looked at me, and I got these Mexicans, and they're talking, and I'm with there showing them the locomotives and opening the panels and showing the EMD. I don't know what happened. Whether Seminar had rights to sell them, or if the Monon was selling them and Seminar get a commission or what, I don't know. But anyhow, I guess the deal fell through because he scrapped them at South Hammond, I guess, later.
I remember as a kid walking around the Roundhouse there and seeing parts from those FMs in that scrap pile by that big silver crane. Rick, we're gonna pivot over to you. I wonder if you could share, do you have any particular interesting or favorite stories, that you like to tell about your days on the Monon?
Yes, I have a favorite story. Now we're after the break.
Well, no, I was asking Rick what he might have.
Oh.
We're just pivoting over there for a minute.
Well, I've got plenty. I'm like Bob, but the first summer I told you about working the Michigan City branch. I'm 16 years old, and I was working at Wanata, and they told me my next assignment was going to be just up the road about 4 miles to Haskell's. Now, Haskell's is a town of about 10 houses on a county road. But the Grand Trunk Western and East and West Railroad crossed the Monon there, and we did one heck of an interchange business. Now the signals stayed, they would stay green for the Grand Trunk, except when a Monon train wanted to cross, and we would have to time the signals off, turn them red, and let the Monon across. So I went up to train a little bit one night, and the fellow told me, he says, now when you come to work at 6 o'clock on Monday morning, he said, the Monon train will be sitting there at the red signal waiting to get across. And he said, before you turn those signals red for the Grand Trunk, he said, you check on that Grand Trunk passenger train that's due by here about 6:10. He said, you let him go first if he's on time. So I'm gung-ho, and the first Monday morning is a bright morning, and I get to work there. And sure enough, number 56, Monon train sitting there at the red signal. And I went in and looked at my little box. I didn't see any trains on the interlocking box that showed anything within about 3 miles. So I flipped the signals red and let them time off, which was an FRA. It was an FRA rule that they had to time off. I think it was 3 to 5 minutes before you could turn it red for the other, or green for the other train. So that morning I let it time off, and I gave the Monon train the signal, and he goes plodding across the interlocking crossing there about 15 miles an hour to make his set off. Well, while I'm outside watching him, I hear this toot toot in the distance. And I looked up east of town, and sure enough, there's that headlight of that passenger train a couple miles away. And then I remembered what they told me, to let him go first. So I didn't have any choice but to let the Monon clear the interlocking. Then I turned the signal green for the Grand Trunk. Well, that passenger train come by. The engineer was hanging his head out the window, shaking his fist at me. Conductor was on the rear car. He was shaking his fist at me. They got into Chicago and turned in 5 minutes delay on the interlocking. So needless to say, I earned a call from the Grand Trunk chief dispatcher wanting to know what happened, and I told him. He assured me it wouldn't happen again, and I assured him that he was correct, that it wouldn't happen again. But that was my first encounter with well, let's put it like this. I wasn't used to handling that kind of freight on the I&L branch with coal.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I guess we all have to be famous for stabbing a hot passenger train or hot train at least once, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. If we didn't do it, we weren't
we weren't out there.
Yeah.
That's pretty neat. That's pretty neat. Bob, you said you had one too?
Yes, I told you before, where they brought this carload of coal in, and I had to patch the center sill and never saw it again.
Yes.
All right. I started my own business at my own shop out in Cherville in 1971, and I'm still on the Monon mailing on the list for scrap cars, you know. And so I got a listing, and here there's 26 of these low style, or 26 of these steel gondolas that they're selling. And so I went down and looked at them, and I stopped to see Jacoba, and I said, will these cars all move? And so I put the bid in on them, and I got them, and they said, well, there's 25 of these 25 cars can move, but the 26th one is at Lafayette and needs some repairs. Well, I had made a deal with Republic Steel that I was furnishing gondolas for Republic Steel, and so I started and brought some of found 10 of the good ones, and they sent them to Buffalo and Canton, Ohio, and everything else. And then I went to Lafayette to see the one that needed repairs. And here is the 3252 that I welded the center sill on 15 years earlier. And it's for sale, that I buy it. And I took a piece of center sill down to Lafayette and patched the center sill and sold it to Republic Steel, that I worked on the same car on the same end twice in my lifetime and in the car's lifetime.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, same car, same patch, same everything.
I think we should mention
the second time it was mine. The first time it was the Monon's.
I think we should mention that you don't really seem to believe in that R word, that retirement word, do you? Because you're still working today.
No,
If I'm not mistaken, you're still working today, correct?
yeah, I'm working on a deal now for finding a plastic pellet car for one of my old customers for storage, and the guys that I'm talking to said, yeah, we got one that's up in Alberta, Canada, and they sent me up. So I turned 91 January 6th.
Congratulations.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing.
The modeling keeps your mind working, and your physical working, and God's given me good health.
Well, let's see. Rick, you got another one?
Well, in thinking back to Mr. Barriger again, talking about the problems with being a sales agent on the railroad, and I wasn't, but when I was living in Lafayette, this would have been, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s, before the merger. My neighbor who had just gotten out of Purdue University come across the street one day, and he said he'd gotten a job with U.S. Gypsum down in Shoals, Indiana. He says, we got a little problem. He said, we've got 3 customers here in Lafayette. They're all located on the Wabash Railroad, or at the time, I guess it was the N&W. And he said, they all get wallboard in here. And he said, the railroad service, we just can't deal with it. We don't know when we're going to get it, when we're going to get the cars. And he said, we'd love to give this business back to the railroads from the trucks because it's a lot cheaper. And he said, how long does it take to get a car from Shoals, Indiana, up here to Lafayette? So I told him that it was on the B&O Railroad west of Mitchell, Indiana, and they would have to interchange the cars to us at Mitchell. We'd bring the cars to Lafayette. So I said, that's about a one-day job, and then the yard engine at night will deliver it to the Wabash to go across town. So he said, well, we'll give it a shot. So they started shipping, and I was a dispatcher, so I could kind of watch for the cars and do a little bit to boost and make sure they made it up on time. And that lasted for a couple months. It amounted to about, I don't know, 3 or 4 cars a week. And then the business quit. So one day I was over at his house and I said, what happened? He said, well, it was just exactly like you said it would be when it get from the B&O to Mitchell and Lafayette. He says, from the time the Monon would deliver that car to the Wabash at Lafayette, it was taking 6 to 7 days to get across town.
Oh my gosh.
So no matter how good a sales agent is, you're only as good as everybody around you.
That's your service. That's right.
It's your service. So I think that's the main thing I've got.
You know, another little quirk that came up when both of you were talking, and specifically you, Bob, was that's interesting, maybe of interest to the people that are on this call, is that South Hammond Yard was actually 2 yards. The one yard was where you received
North Yard and South Yard.
Yeah, North Yard and South Yard, where you'd receive and dispatch road trains and transfers. And right through the middle of the South Yard was 173rd Street, which when I was hanging around the yard had 13 tracks. So imagine a yard where you have a fairly busy street bisecting 13 tracks, and it had a manual gate because they had a gate watchman.
And had a tower man, yeah.
And so, and I know many times I'd see them kick cars, and the gate operator would have to kind of time when to put the gates down so they didn't pop cars crossing. That's pretty unique. There are other yards elsewhere that certainly have interesting situations like that, but that was always one of the most interesting that I found, that right through the body tracks of the yard is a main street.
Right. And that guy up there was always he like an owl. he was like an owl. I mean, sometimes he'd sit there and read a book because there was no traffic for 2 hours, you know. And he had a buzzer up there that when the northbound trains hit Ridge Road, the buzzer went off. So if he was doing something, he knew that there was a train. And the same way with Highland Street from the north, when the southbound trains hit Highland Street, he knew something was coming.
Yep.
But
Yep.
during the switching operations, boy, oh boy, the switch crews both ways from the south engine and the north engine, and shuffling cars around. Yeah.
Pretty interesting situation. You know, towards the latter days, and both of you have experience with this. Towards the latter days, I have some consists for number 70 from the latter days, and you know, on a 70 or 80 car train, you might have 50 or 60 cars blocked out of shops just for the BRC, and the rest of the cars would be for Hammond, but they were for BNOCT or IHB, which really reinforced at the end the Monon was primarily a bridge carrier from Chicago to Louisville. You know,
Right.
had quite a few big industries online, you know, at New Albany and along the line in different locations, but a lot of that traffic was, particularly on 70, being a hot train, was, you know, get it offline as soon as possible so you're not picking up car hire, you know, on those cars after midnight.
There were 3 or 4 big meat shippers. Hornell was one, Rath was another one, and Swift. The Hormel refrigerators were NADX cars with the big Hormel on it, and the Rath ones had the Indian head logo on it, and Swift was the first mechanical ones. They were aluminum painted cars that had a mechanical refrigeration unit in it, and both the IHB in the morning and the IHB at night would always have a block of 8 or 10 refrigerator cars from these 3 companies that would either go into 73 or into 71. But it was a pretty even everyday move that much meat would come through going south.
And
you know when they made up now 71 was made up with 2 sections, Southern, L&N, three sections, Southern, L&N, Louisville proper. Louisville proper was at the rear, Southern was at the head end, and L&N in the middle. And then on 73 during the daytime, every once in a while you had cars for New Albany, and those were a couple of cars were on the head end of the train, and then the Southerns, and then the Louisvilles, and then the shorts at the back end. The Lafayette cars were the shorts that would come off on Lafayette on 73 going down.
Yeah, New Albany was an interesting situation in that it seems to me, you guys know better than I would, but it seems to me that on the whole railroad, that was probably the greatest concentration of customers on the Monon proper anywhere, because there were a lot of customers there right at New Albany. And I know that, I think it was about 54 that they built the storage track that Rick mentioned earlier, because number 71 would drop cars into that track for Pillsbury, which was built in 1954. And number 71, I think, would pull cars from that were northbound, right? So that or whichever northbound train it was, so that the New Albany switcher wouldn't have to take the cars onto the KNIT and pay the KNIT for them having the cars on KNIT. it seemed like a pretty interesting arrangement and pretty unique for the Monon to do something, or pretty innovative, I guess, for the Monon to do that, you know, to avoid paying. And I guess a lot of the coal from the Southern came up via French Lick so that they didn't have to interchange in Louisville or New Albany because it would be more expensive. We do have a question. Oh, we have a question here from Nick. Can either one of you speak to any unique operating issues to the stone traffic coming out of the Stone Belt area? And those are probably heavy trains or at least heavy cars.
Well, by the time I began working, there was very little stone business except for breakwater stone. The breakwater stone, of course, was when they were building the port at Michigan City. And in the summer, that could run anywhere from 20 to 50 carloads a day. And we called them sinkers because it would only be about 3 pieces of stone in a gon. And there was a little bit of traffic other than that, but that was the biggest hunk of it. And of course, Bob could speak better than I could about the problems with some of those big pieces of stone in a gon. The problems
Move all over.
Blocking and shifted loads and everything, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, Nick,
That's right.
The one photo that you posted, Nick, of that crane on the waterfront, that was at the breakwater, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, it was up at the breakwater.
Where they're bringing stone up for breakwater use. Yeah.
Yep.
And I know they took some to Chicago too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they did.
I was gonna say all the stone around the Fields Museum and everything in Chicago is old breakwater stone.
You know, it's interesting. Several years ago, when I lived in Dallas, they built Carolyn Hunt built a hotel. Shoot, I can't even remember the name of it now. Anyway, a really very, very nice high-end hotel, and it was built of Southern Indiana oolitic limestone, and there was just truck after truck after truck coming from Southern Indiana unloading limestone for that hotel. That was like old home week for me.
You know, you was talking about coal. I've been going through the dispatcher's train sheets at Salem lately, and well, I organized them, and in the late 60s, we were getting big trains of coal from the Southern, and it could amount to 50, 60, 70 carloads a day. It wasn't always that much, but I found one sheet where we had 2 trains received in a day. One went to Michigan City. I presume it was NIPSCO, I don't know, and the other train went to Chicago. So we did have a good business on that little old passenger line.
Yeah, just a little 17-mile branch line. And, you know, I'll tell a story on Ron's behalf since he can't join us today. I remember he said that when they had the big C628s, that they would generally run 2 or sometimes 3 of those light with a caboose down to French Lick to pull a cut of coal off Southern and take it north. And for those of you who are not as familiar with the Monon, there was a pretty tall, pretty long trestle called over the Lost River in Paoli, Indiana. And he said the first time they ran down there with the 400s that they told the road foreman he had to ride that train. He says, I don't know what would have, they said, well, they were worried about the rating of the bridge. They said, nah, engineering said, no, it's good enough. But they put a road foreman on there anyway. And he says, I don't know what they thought. Yeah, it was Russ Jackson. Exactly. I don't know what they thought I would do. If the bridge did decide to collapse, what am I going to write it down? So, but I imagine that was pretty, a little bit hair raising to take those 69-foot six motors, across that bridge and then come back with a coal train. George has mentioned the stone cars were added at the end of the train at McDowell. It created a real headache to pull north. I can imagine to have that much weight on the back of the train. Nobody ever wants that. Nobody ever wants that. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, right, Nick?
Right.
Anything else you want to wrap up with, guys?
No, one other thing, a little story I happened to notice in the train sheets was the fact that we talked about not before Mr. Barriger came, they tended not to run a train till they had a full train. And I found one record, well, it would have been from the 60s, where 73 left Lafayette with one load. And that was all he had. And he got to Bloomington, he picked up one or two more cars, and then he picked up the Bedford, a pickup at Bedford, went into Youngtown Yard in Louisville with about 12 cars. Of course, they needed that power down in Louisville to bring the train back north, but they didn't hesitate to run that train. I'm sure they lost money on that day, but they kept the customers going.
Right, and well, and plus, as you mentioned, that crew would work a turn from McDowell to Youngtown and come back north on 70 or 72, whichever one it was, right?
That's correct. They did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, one thing to your point, or your question earlier, Nick, about that you mentioned, Rick, is the archives at Salem. I mean, for those who are members of the Monon Society, you have access to the archives at Monon, which have it's a treasure trove of Monon documents and track maps and dispatcher sheets and photographs and all kinds of stuff that for someone who has whether they're a model or not, has an interest in the Monon, that's Mecca. The museum, the Depot Museum and the world headquarters for the Monon Society in Salem is absolute Mecca. You have anything else, Bob?
Well, I was just listening to Rick. The best turnaround crew trains on the Monon were 72 north out of Lafayette and 71 back out of South Hammond. The 72 left Lafayette like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, would get into South Hammond at 7 o'clock or 7:15, and the crew would put the engines back to get sanded and fueled, and they would get back on and get on 71 and be back home by midnight.
Yeah.
So it was almost like a 4 to 12 job every other day.
That's power utilization. That's
2 days pay.
That was the best job on the Monon.
And 2 days pay. Yep, exactly. 2 days pay. Not bad. Not bad.
Yeah, right. And every other day you got 2 days pay.
Yep.
Dave has asked us if were there any much delays due to freight train interference or anything like that?
Every day. Of course, Bob talked about when he worked, there were more trains out of South Hammond, but yeah, every night, for example, when I worked third shift, 71 would meet 70 south of Lafayette, generally at Linden. Of course, with longer freight trains during the 60s, we didn't have that many long sidings. So we had to do a lot of planning. As a dispatcher, I hated to delay a train more than 20 minutes, but sometimes it just wasn't possible with the longer freight trains.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, I know, Nick, you had a few announcements to wrap us up, a couple of housekeeping items.
Yeah, just for everyone who's on the call who may not have heard this earlier, we will be taking the recording we've been making during this session. It's going to be available through the library's University of Missouri Digital Library, which is our digital home. And we do have a YouTube channel as well, where we will be posting the video recording, since we're using PowerPoints and props for this event. And hopefully that'll be online later this coming week. I'll have to take the presentation and do a little bit of editing, but that's it. And if once we're able to be traveling again, the collection at the library is accessible to the public. You don't have to be a student at the University of Missouri St. Louis to utilize our holdings. We do prefer folks ask for an appointment if they want to look at Mr. Barriger's papers. one, it helps us narrow down which of the many Monon boxes we bring up from the basement. Keeps us from getting the big book truck out to do that, and helps you utilize your time because, you know, as much as I like St. Louis, I know, you know, everyone else has to go home after a while at the end of the day. So we try to make things as efficient as possible for everyone. So in conjunction with the Monon Historical Society Archives, the Barriger Collection, and as Kevin had mentioned, it is a wide but not necessarily deep collection of railroads across the United States. But when Barriger is running a railroad, the collection is actually really extensive for the time period he's president. So the Monon is a nice slice of the history of that company for his tenure. And again, very accessible for the reading room, but just let us know ahead of time. And I see Dave Hammer has one question. With newer technologies being adapted with railroading over the years, was it easy or harder to learn the new techniques? Dave, is this like for operating technology, you know, like with dynamic braking and stuff? Dispatching, okay.
Dispatching.
Well, of course, on the Monon, we still, most of the time it was with automatic block signals and train orders. Later on in the L&N, they went to a manual block system where you did away with the operators and train orders and just talked directly to the trains. And that sounds, it would be simpler, but I can tell you it added many gray hairs to my head. Part of the problem with that was that we had to block section men and signal maintainers just like trains. On the Monon previously, we just gave them a lineup and they got out and did their work, and it was up to them to dodge the trains. So in some ways it made a big change, and if I was just dispatching trains only, it would have been simple, but it wasn't.
Okay. Well, Kevin, thank you for leading this session and for your presentation.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for including me. I appreciate it.
And I'd like to thank the Monon Historical Society and the enthusiast groups for helping to promote this by letting me make postings on Facebook and getting the word out to their membership. We will be doing another one of these. It looks like this was successful enough that the test, you guys, once again, the Monon was the guinea pig for a Barriger institution. And so we'll probably be doing one, maybe the Rock Island. I'll be reaching out to some other groups with railroads Mr. Barriger worked with. And we'll put an announcement out once we have some programs together. So thank you all very, very much for attending. We appreciate it. And thank you very much to Bob and Rick and Kevin for attending and presenting and sharing your experiences with us. This was great, and we are very, very, very grateful for your help. I'm sorry we didn't get Frank and we didn't get Ron today. They were very helpful to work with us on planning, and I hope maybe we could do a makeup session later on with Monon Part 2.
Fair enough.
Sound great.
All right.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
You
you so
too.
much.
Everybody have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.